Comrades, why is the Soviet sun so happy in the morning? Because it knows that by evening it will be in the West. Greetings, welcome to History of Economic Thought 2, Hillsdale College. And we're going to have a two-part lecture series now on Soviet economics. When we left off, we had done the Socialist Calculation Debate, and we discussed Mises and Hayek, their argument that socialism can't work because it abolishes markets. It abolishes markets in particular for capital goods, and so the socialist planner will have no way of allocating rationally, no idea of what the opportunity cost of any decision is. Well, this is a great blackboard discussion, a theoretical academic discussion. And the attitude that the mainstream economists end up with, thinking that Oscar Lange's argument for market socialism shows that the socialist calculation, that the socialist planner can calculate, they think that the socialist side has won. And the attitude is exemplified, as I pointed out, by Paul Samuelson's undergraduate textbook, a world bestseller. Samuelson lived 1915 to 2009. He received his Nobel Prize in 1970. But in his textbook, he says the following thing. The Soviet Union poses a difficult question for the United States. Is the economic superiority of central planning worth the trade-off that we would have to give up in political freedom? So again, let that sink in, because that stayed in his textbook all the way into the 1980s. And eventually, 1991, the Soviet Union has an economic collapse, political collapse, and everyone has to reevaluate. Why? What happened? Well, this is that story. So I'm going to give you a quick history of the Soviet Union, and then we'll talk about the economics. But in the Soviet Union, Mises' challenge is not an academic problem. It's the fundamental issue. Tsarist Russia had some industrialization, but it was largely agricultural. It was quite backwards by Western standards. The serfs themselves were effectively slaves until they were liberated and set free in 1861. Russia was not a modern economy by the standards of 1900. They were developing industrialization, developing what we could call a market system. In 1914 to 1918, Russia fought on the side of the Allies, on the side of Britain and France against Germany, and Russia fought badly. It was not a wealthy country. It was impoverished. They didn't fight well, and it was very difficult. The Bolshevik Revolution is not the first revolution that Russia had, but it began with what they call the February Revolution, which for us is March, because they were on the Julian calendar, whereas the modern calendar, of course, is the Gregorian calendar. But they had their February Revolution, the Bourgeois Revolution. Nicholas II, the Tsar, abdicated, stepped down, and the provisional government came in, and it ended up being headed by Alexander Kerensky. And he believed that this would bring a kind of capitalism, maybe a kind of socialism kind of mixed with it, but it was kind of vague. But this was a time of confusion. What's key for us is the 1917 Bolshevik October Revolution. They call it the October Revolution, and again, it occurred in November on our calendar. But the Marxists seized power, led by Lenin and led by Trotsky. Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. Now, for a Marxist, this is a problematic issue, because the socialist revolution was supposed to occur in the most advanced capitalist system, not in this proto-capitalist system, this almost feudal, backwards agricultural country. And so Lenin and the other Soviet writers had to spend enormous volumes of writing trying to justify why this was, trying to explain why this was justified, trying to make Marx fit their situation. And a central issue of all this writing becomes how you run the economy. This is what we call Marxism Leninism, develops at this time. And And so this is adapting Marxism to the Russian situation. And Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, the others saw themselves in this as economists. They're trying to figure out how to run the society, how to manage the economy once they abolish markets. So there's this actual line that runs from Adam Smith to Ricardo, to Marx, to Lenin, to Stalin. It's a very strange family tree, but they see themselves as economists. So I'm going to gloss over some very important issues in all of this history, but I'm going to give you a brief history of the Soviet economy and then talk about the details. Many of the things that we think of as being perversities of the Soviet communism were actually economic policies. If you try to replace markets, these are the things that logically you'll be driven to. So much of this will make sense in the context of we have to get rid of capitalism. We have to get rid of markets. This is what we'll be left with. So there's a logic to this. It's important we understand it. It's not perverse. It's the consequence of trying to abolish the market system. So here's our history of the Soviet economy. Soviet economic history. And this will reveal their economic thinking. And the first period is what we will call war communism. The period of war communism. I'll put dates on these instead of numbering them. The period of war communism runs from 1918 to 1921. (1918 to 1921), this is the period of the Russian Civil War, the Reds versus the Whites. This is followed by, I'll do it this way, the new economic policy. Or NEP. And this one runs from 1921 to about 19 well, I've got a date for it, 28. I was about to say 1930, but 1928. Great. This is followed by the period of 5-year plans. 5-year planning really runs from 1928 until 1921. How about 91? The end of the Soviet Union. They follow the 5-year planning. And there's another point in here, which is from 1985 to 1991, is also the period of perestroika, restructuring. I'll say a bit about that as well. The period of perestroika and reform, which is from about 1988, really we could say a little bit before that, 1985 to 1991. And of course, 1991 is the end of history for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union breaks up. Great. Well, let's say a bit about each one of these periods. The period of war communism here, that's the Russian Civil War. Russian Civil War consists of the Soviets immediately make peace. I should mention this. This is an important part of this story. The World War I was very unpopular in Russia because of the heavy casualties and the losses that were occurring on the front. And when Kerensky and the moderates take over in March, they continue the war. They say, we will stay in the war on the side of the Allies. That's very unpopular. The Soviets promise that when they take over, they will end the war. And they do. They make a peace treaty with Germany. Russia gets out of World War I. And immediately, a bloody civil war breaks out in Russia. The Civil War pits the Marxists against the Tsarists, against the liberals in a classical liberal sense, and also against foreign troops who are in Russia as part of the war effort, World War I. Now, the foreign troops play a relatively minor role, but it very much feeds into Soviet paranoia that the West is out to get them. And this this has an important influence on their thinking. Well, war communism, during this period, Lenin and the others get the idea that we need to move very, very quickly. Maybe we can establish a communist system overnight. The war effort requires it. And so we are going to abolish private property. We're going to abolish trading on markets. We're going to even try to abolish money. Well, as you can imagine, this is an utter failure. It doesn't work. They requisition goods. They confiscate grain from peasants. It's draconian, and it doesn't help the economy. And of course, you're in the midst of a civil war. Well, that's all we need to say about it, except to say that the Russian Civil War, the Marxists come out and win this. The Marxists at first think they are going to lose, but they manage to win the Civil War, beat the whites, and they now establish Russia as a Marxist country and begin establishing the Soviet Union. At the end of the Civil War, the economy is a shambles. It's in ruins, and they have to do something about that. Lenin begins thinking about this, and he institutes what is called the new economic policy. We have the new economic policy, and they call it the NEP, N-E-P. And this is a set of reforms. And what do they do with these reforms? They say we've got to get the economy restarted. They will say you institute private property, and especially in farming, small-scale sales and things, and small factories. So the new economic policy permits private property on a small scale. It permits market trading. You may trade for profit. It becomes legal, and the people who do that are called NEP men. New economic policy men. These are traders. They often thought to be kind of shady, but trading for profit is allowed. It's permitted. And then the government retains what Lenin calls the commanding heights of the economy. You've heard of the expression, the commanding heights of the economy. It comes from Lenin and the NEP. We're going to free up the economy, but we are going to retain the commanding heights. That's transportation, that's major industries, utilities, so heavy industries like steel production, etc. And so the commanding heights will remain controlled by the state, the central planners. That is by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Great. And there's some success to this. There's an end to the war. That's important because now people can simply start producing. They can have agriculture and things again instead of hiding from the armies. The private properties and the market trading allow the economy to begin recovering. And Lenin puts it this way. These don't seem like very Marxist things, but Lenin says we have to take one step backward in order to take two steps forward. We've got to get back on our feet. That's what they're doing. If you're interested in this period, I won't say much more about it. There's a book by Ayn Rand, her first novel, and it's We the Living. It's actually my favorite novel that Rand wrote, but it all takes place in the Soviet Union, in Russia, under the new economic policy, and it describes it. She lived that. And so this is really a first-hand account. It's great. It's a great novel. So We the Living by Rand. Well, Lenin passes away. He dies in 1924. And who becomes a leading advocate of NEP? Nikolai Bukharin. You may remember this name, but he's a Soviet economist. Why would you remember Bukharin? Oh, what do we have? 1888 to 1938. 1888, 1938, Soviet economist. Why would you remember him? Well, you should remember that he was a student of Eugen Bombaverk, the great Austrian economist. He was one of the people who attended Bombaverk's seminar because he's a Marxist. And he said, I'm going to go and refute Bombaverk's arguments on against the labor theory of value. Bukharin attends the seminar and comes away saying, I can't do it. And the Austrians are our greatest intellectual enemies. Well, as it turns out, Bukharin learned quite a bit of economics from von Bauwerk. And he becomes a leading advocate of NEP. And he says that the NEP incentives are crucial for production. Profit is a useful tool that we Bolsheviks have to use. We will use profit to motivate people. And in fact, we will tell the peasants, earn profits. Go out and engage in agriculture, be productive and earn profits, because that will make the Soviet state rich. It'll make the peasants rich. We'll get some economic growth going. Well, that actually raises a pretty interesting and difficult question for the Soviets, because he brings up this issue of peasants. Well, what is the role of the peasants? The peasants are backwards. They are not proletarians. They don't have proletarian consciousness. They're superstitious. They're Orthodox Christians. The Russian peasants are used to a kind of communism because they lived a communal lifestyle, but it's not Marxism. The Ukrainian peasants, they're even worse from the Marxist standpoint, because they are very suspiciously capitalistic. They have private property. They don't go for this communal lifestyle. And in fact, they work on markets all the time, and some of them are rich. Rich peasants are called kulaks. They're not trustworthy at all. How do peasants fit into Marx's scheme? They don't. It's supposed to be the proletarians, the advanced state. So the peasant question comes up. And the peasant question is, can the peasants be part of the Bolshevik or a Marxist revolution? And if so, what's their role? How can they fit in? Lenin and Stalin both answer yes, but it takes all kinds of convoluted argumentation, and it leaves them with the problem of what do we do with them. But here's a little book by Comrade Stalin, Foundations of Leninism, and treating the fundamental problems of Marxism Leninism. And chapter 5, the peasant problem, where he says, some think the fundamental thing in Leninism is the peasant problem, that the point of departure of Leninism is the problem of peasantry, its role and the relative importance. This is absolutely wrong. The fundamental problem of Leninism is its point of departure. That's not the peasant problem, but the problem of dictatorship of the proletariat. The peasant problem is a derivative problem. Once we know how the dictatorship will work, we'll figure out how to work the peasants into the revolution. So this is how they conceive of this as being a crucial question. Well, Lenin passes away, 1924, and with his death, Stalin begins solidifying his own power. Now, some of you are familiar with the idea from Hayek that in a centrally planned system, the worst get on top. What happens in a system in which we have uncontrolled, where we give full authority with no checks, no balances to the leaders, that is in a central planning system, what happens is the most ruthless get on top. Those who are best at manipulating that system and getting the others. So it's those who are the most ruthless and those who are the luckiest. And Stalin is ruthless. He has long experience at really criminal activity. He'd been involved in bank robberies and all sorts of things prior to the revolution. Well, in 1928, he's now in power, and he starts thinking about this. He says, we need to advance more quickly. We're behind the West. And he comes up with this proposal for central planning via 5-year plans. The 5-year plans are gone, but soon will be the NEP. And so we'll enter the period of the 5-year plans. We'll just call it this. And so now we're under the question of Joseph Stalin. Who is now in charge. And his goal is rapid collectivization. That's what we have to do. And so we need to have central plans. The NEP, okay, fine, we've done that. But now we need to have rapid industrialization. But how do we finance that? How can we pay for it? Well, that says industrialization. Great. Well, his answer is, why don't we collectivize agriculture? And a number of the Soviet thinkers say, that's the source, that's the solution, because that's what we have. We have agriculture, we'll collectivize it. And so the peasant question becomes this: how do we make the peasants help to pay for this? And Stalin's two leading economists are, first of all, Nikolai Bukharin. And Bukharin says, here's what we should do. We should encourage peasants to produce. We will reward them with profits. Don't regulate them. Don't threaten them. They're not very trustworthy. They panic easily. They're superstitious. Don't fill them with fear. Instead, let them earn profits. Don't kill their incentive to produce. Don't kill their incentive to adopt better agricultural methods. Instead, tell them, enrich yourselves. Enrich yourselves, become more productive. And then we can tax that productivity, and we'll slowly absorb them into collectives, and then we will get them, we'll impart to them the proper communist consciousness, the proper Soviet consciousness. Okay? Great. We're going to focus on internal development here, that way, using economic incentives. Stalin has another, his other top economist is Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. And Preobrazhensky takes a different viewpoint. Oh, he lived 1886 to 1937. Funny, they similar, passed away at about the same time. Anyway, wonder why that is. Anyway, Preobrazhensky says, what we actually need is what Trotsky has called primitive socialist accumulation. What's that? That's socialist saving. So he endorses the idea of primitive socialist accumulation. But how do you make those savings? That's a term that comes from Leon Trotsky. But how do you make those savings? Well, you do it this way. The peasants, he says, first of all, how is it that the West became rich? How did the capitalist countries become rich? I think it's because they exploited their colonies. They stole everything. That's what he says. And so how do we become rich? The peasants are an internal colony. Exploit them, squeeze them, take it out of them. So the peasants as an internal colony. An internal colony, and that's to be exploited. That's how we'll do it. Now, Stalin listens to these arguments, and he picks Preobrazhensky. He's convinced by this, and he thinks Preobrazhensky's right. He doesn't trust the peasants, especially the Ukrainian peasants. They're untrustworthy. They respect private property. They're private property owners. They're greedy. They're not collectivistic. They don't have the communist mentality. So squeeze them. That's Stalin. We don't trust them anyway. And as a result, the peasants are told the following: we're going to collectivize agriculture. You join the collective farm. We're imposing huge grain taxes on you. Go join the farm, pay the grain tax, And you do that or you die. The grain taxes will be used then to finance industrialization. We can sell grain abroad, and they begin doing that. They finance industrial development that way. It kind of works. And what are the consequences of this? Well, it does work. This is a book that details this. This is Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest. There are a number of books out. This is a very good one on this story. And the Soviet collectivization and the terror famine. Let me just read a little bit from the preface, how this book begins. The task of the historian is the notoriously difficult one of trying to represent clearly and in a few hundred pages events which cover years of time and nations of men and women. We may perhaps put this in perspective in the present case by saying that in the actions here recorded, about 20 human lives were lost, not for every word, but for every letter in this book. Okay, you see those pages, you see those letters. Every one of those represents 20 dead human beings from this collectivization. How many died? Maybe 14 million. Nobody really knows. It hit the Ukrainians the hardest. It hit Kazakhstan. It hit Russia. The Ukrainians have a name for this, the Holodomor, the hunger. It was mostly Ukrainians who resisted. The starvation that was imposed on people became so severe that the Soviets began putting up posters to remind people that cannibalism was wrong. Things got so bad that families would sit and they would say, in order to have our family survive, which family member are we going to eat? Now, Paul Samuelson passed away, so I can't ask him this question, but I so want to ask him. So, Professor Samuelson, with your Nobel Prize, would you please tell me, just how much growth do we need to make the political cost worth it? Since that's a big problem for you to understand. Well, this shambles worsens. You know, people die. Large numbers of people die. And agricultural output actually doesn't grow from this. Yes, they confiscate grain, but it doesn't mean that agricultural output is growing. They just have taken stuff away that people were going to eat. And so as this shambles worsens, Bukharin quickly sees which way its wind's blowing, and he says, oh yeah, forget the NEP and those kinds of things. Yeah, we want to follow this. But he gets blamed for it, and so he loses power, and he's executed. He's shot. Doesn't really matter which side you're on, because he shot first. If there's any bright spot in this, all these people, if you're an advisor to Stalin, chances are better than 50%. You're going to be shot at some point. But at any rate, it's bleak, but it's successful. There's success. The Soviets industrialize. And it's hard to measure because they don't have market prices for most of their stuff. So it's difficult to measure, but there are, in some sense, there's economic growth, and it's high. It's guesstimated that maybe 4% annual growth rate in the Soviet Union in this time. That's pretty drastic, pretty serious economic growth. And the Soviets electrify the country. Some of the stuff makes sense. Some of the decisions must be productive. They electrify the country. They become a major producer of steel, coal, concrete. They build schools all over the place. Soviet education, in many respects, is very strong. They can develop a literate population. They're very good at teaching reading, science, mathematics. Hospitals, polyclinics, they start building those. So there is real economic growth here. What's their method of doing this? So we'll get to the 5-year plans in a moment, but we'll see something about how this industrialization works. And this is interesting, important. Let's graph it this way. We'll think of it this way. That's output per worker. If we have output per worker here, and on this axis, we'll put capital per worker. So put that as a K. That's capital per worker. Great. And we know from Bombavert that more capital means more productivity. And so we're going to draw a production function. Here's our production function for a given level of technical ability. We'll just call it F naught. Little thing there. And so there's our production function. And the Soviet method is industrialize, more capital, build more factories, put more machines in them. Great. Mobilize more resources, get more iron ore and things like that. Great. Okay. Soviet economic growth. Yep. Output per worker is going up. You see any issue here? Well, we keep growing this way, and we keep getting more and more output, but there's some kind of a diminishing return story setting in, a falling marginal product, diminishing return story. Great. How do you get out of that? How does modern economic growth work? Well, of course, we all know that. We have modern growth is to have technical advance. That is, you change your production function by innovating, by getting better technology, by entrepreneurial activity and such. And that shifts the whole production function up. And so we'll be up to F1 of this. And then we get even better technology. And we have modern economic growth going. And awesome. And the Soviets didn't do that. They didn't solve that problem. Well, why is that? To understand that, we're going to have to start looking at the nuts and bolts of their economy. And so we'll do that next. But this is modern economic growth. That comes from technical advance. That's resource mobilization. Resource mobilization is what they know how to do. And this, as it turns out, will be what they do not know how to do. And they can't solve that problem. Let's see why. Now we're talking about the period of the 5-year plans. But the 5-year plans are a little bit, that's a very big, kind of vague kind of thing, because Stalin says, or whoever the leader is, says, we need, here's our goal for 5 years from now. We want to achieve this, so much industrial output and these sorts of things. How do you do that day to day? We need a blueprint. We need a set of steps to follow. And so they had 1-year plans, and the 1-year plans are the actual economic blueprints, the details of the steps they will take every year in planning. This is what's key. And so let's get our blackboard cleared here, and we'll look at how the 1-year plans work. And this is the 1-year plan. And this is called, the Soviets call it materials balance planning. Materials balance planning. Remember, we're getting rid of the market system. We're not going to allocate according to the market, so we're going to allocate according to a central plan. How do we set that up? Well, here at the very top, we will have the Politburo, or we'll have Stalin, or somebody else, whoever the top decision makers would be. The Soviet term is actually the center, whoever's at the very top. We'll put those guys at the top. So Stalin, Brezhnev, whoever is in charge, and a few other bigwigs who give orders. And they will say, we want to do this in the following year. We really are very excited about having so many tanks and so many missiles made, maybe whatever they're interested in. And they send those orders down the chain, and it goes down. There's a whole series of steps here you might put in, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Congress and all these. Okay, we'll skip all of the details, but it gets down, and we get down to the Central Planning Agency. They have a planning agency, the Государственный комитет планированию. Okay, great. Gosplan, they have very nice ways of shortening things. Gosplan, the state planning agency. And so it goes down to the Gosplan. This is the thing that we would call the Central Planning Bureau. Okay, the CPB, we were calling it in our theoretical story. Gosplan, this planning agency, gets those orders. Now, Gosplan is supposed to come up with a full blueprint for the economy and what is to be done. So they take these orders from Stalin or whomever, and they say, now we have to flesh it out and add other things because he didn't think about how many other items we needed, you know, how much hand sanitizer we need. I've got my hand sanitizer there. Price flexibility as usual. So things like this. So we'll add all those things in. And Gosplan begins developing a plan. Well, what they do is they develop their plan, and they begin sending it downstream to the next layer of bureaucracy, or the next part of the planning system, and that would be the economic ministries. And I'm going to put down a simple schematic of this. It's much more complicated because there are ministries and sub-ministries and all union ministries and then just the constituent republic ministries and things. But we will just simplify. So we've got various economic ministries. What's a ministry? Well, each one of those would correspond each one of these corresponds to the equivalent of an industry in our thinking. So you might have, for example, the steel, the ferrous metals ministry. You might have the truck making industry. And you might have the heavy equipment, like bulldozers ministry, and the electronics industry, and an agricultural ministry, and forestry ministry, fisheries, all these different kinds of things that we would think of. And so we'll put I'll just draw in a few of these, and there's another economic ministry. Great, so each one of those is in charge of a different kind of production. Great, well below them they have various sub-ministries, and they, you know, different branches of those. They send orders down, but they end up down here at the level of the state-owned enterprises. You'll remember I was using this earlier as an abbreviation. The state-owned enterprise, these are the socialist firms, the state firms. So I'll just call those SOEs. And so there's the SOEs under that ministry, and each one has a bunch of state-owned enterprises under it, however many. And great, so here's what they do. Gosplan sends its instructions down to them. They then send, okay, well, we'll send our instructions for each one of the ministries about what they're supposed to produce, etc. And there it is. Well, that's the first step. Those are preliminary orders that have been sent down the chain. The next step is that the state-owned enterprises get their marching orders and they say, okay, we're supposed to make, well, comrades, we're supposed to make, well, it says 10,000 trucks. That means what do we need? We'll need 40,000 tires from the tire making industry, and we'll need a whole bunch of sheet metal from the sheet metal industry, and we'll need various kinds of things. So they assemble a list of the things they will need to hit those targets. What materials do they need? Okay? And they send those requests for materials back up the chain. So this is the materials orders going back up the chain. Everybody's sending their orders up, et cetera, et cetera. And the ministry gets theirs. Okay, this is all the stuff our different enterprises need. We'll send those orders up to Gosplan. And we'll send ours up, and we'll send ours up, and et cetera. We'll assemble all that. And now Gosplan is all set. They have, on the one hand, the set of their preliminary targets they want to hit. And secondly, they have a list of the materials they will need, materials balance planning. And now all Gosplan has to do is, first of all, calculate all the feasible plans, the ways of achieving this. And secondly, they will then pick the optimal, the best, least cost plan. Now there's one problem with this. And that's that Gosplan was never able to figure out a feasible plan. We got the request for inputs. We know what the outputs we want are. We can't solve this problem. We can't come up with a feasible plan. We can't achieve it. Now what are we going to do? Well, we got to do something. So we're just going to send targets down, final targets down, and say, get as close as you can. Do the best you can. And so then they send the final marching orders back down, and that's in the blue, light blue, if you can see that. Everybody gets their orders down here, and there it is. Great. Do the best you can. Okay. Well, that brings up a couple of interesting questions. First of all, how do you get these? How do you ensure compliance with the plan? How do you get people to do what you're asking? Secondly, how do you measure or find out whether they've actually followed the plan? How are you going to do that? Now, in the market system, we know how that works. That's called profit and loss. That does both of those problems. People want to earn profits, so they will try to respond to consumer demand. They want to avoid losses, so they try to respond to consumer demand. And so that ensures that people will try to have the incentive to try to follow. And then profit and loss also give a feedback signal as to whether they were successful or not. But this is the Soviet system. We're getting rid of that irrational, anarchic market stuff. So we have to find a different way to do it. How do we ensure compliance with the plan? Well, first of all, we have to think about incentives. How do we ensure compliance? And the first thing is, well, how about, how do we incentivize compliance? And the first possibility is terror. Right from the start, the Soviets begin doing this. Lenin introduces this. This is not something that is just with Stalin. Lenin introduces this idea. That's how we are going to control people. So the KGB, or the equivalent, the NKVD, the OGPU, whatever they were being called at the time, enforces this. If you don't hit the targets, you're accused of sabotage and to the gulag with you, or execution. And people are executed for this sort of thing. You failed to hit the target that you were given. So that's one thing. That's a policy. Well, you have to do that. You have to do something like that. You've got to have a way of incentivizing things, because it's profit and loss. We're abolishing that. We're abolishing market incentives. That stuff's immoral, supposedly. Okay. What's another one? Well, another one is propaganda. Soviet let's spell it right at least. Propaganda. Soviet system is infamous for this. The Soviets are famous for, these kinds of things. And in factories, there was a political commissar in each factory, a zampolit, or whatever they called them, and a Communist Party official who would monitor things, and they would observe, and they would remind workers that they're building the future. This is important. They have political rallies, political education meetings. Now, part of that was just to convince workers, you have to do this, because this is building the future. Do what we're telling you. There's your orders. Follow it. This is so important, because someday we'll be in utopia. We're building communism. And so that's why they have those sorts of things. That's a feature of their system. Another thing, though, that we see is, we've got the sticks. How about rewards? And in particular, well, you could get medals and things like that, which probably falls into that category, but bonuses, rewards. Payment of bonuses for meeting and then exceeding the targets. If you hit the target, we're going to pay you extra. And in fact, that extra might be 40% of your income. 40% of your annual income depends on whether or not you hit the target that you've been assigned here. And there you are. That's a very strong incentive, paid to everybody from the bottom up, the lowest workers on up. And so this works in a sense, because everybody wants to avoid the gulag and they want to receive their bonus. So, okay, we'll follow the system. And great. How does that work in practice? We'll say a little bit about it now. Let's see, we'll clear this. And what are the incentives of the Soviet firm, the state-owned enterprise? SOE incentive is to hit the target. That is, achieve the target, make your quota of stuff, and exceed it if you can. You definitely want to do that. In fact, you want to do that at any cost. And so here are the Soviet firm's incentives. First of all, overestimate input needs. Okay, we're doing this materials balance planning where we're making requests for materials. Well, the system we know we're not coming up with a feasible plan. It's not reliable. We can't count on getting the stuff we need. And so we're told to make 10,000 trucks. And we think, okay, to do that, we need 100 tons of steel. But if we request 100 tons of steel, we might only get 50. Let's request 200 tons. It's more than we need, but if we only get half, we'll be in great shape. And that way, if we get extra, great, we do something with it. Or we don't care. It's not like we're paying for it. It's not like we're going to go bankrupt. So overestimate your input needs. Everybody does that. Here's another thing. Underestimate capacity. When those orders come down and this whole discussion goes through that chain, that's actually a negotiation. And firms, to at least some extent, depending on their political pull, have the ability to say, comrade, you just had 10,000 trucks? We can't possibly do that. This factory is capable of making 5,000 trucks. And it's a negotiation. And so you say, let's get ourselves a low target. We're going to push a low target for us. And so you underestimate your capacity, overestimate your input needs. What else do you do? Well, how about new technology? Don't adopt new technology. Don't innovate. I'll put that down twice. That's important. Don't innovate. Oh, for heaven's sakes. If you improve your technology so you can make more output with your given inputs, they're going to raise your quota. You don't want that. That's harder to hit. So don't adopt new technology. That'll just raise your targets. You have nothing to gain from that. So don't innovate. And they don't. What else do you do? What's another incentive? You produce stuff, output, that barely qualifies, barely satisfies the story. We'll talk about it in a little more detail, but you don't worry about quality standards. If consumers don't like it, it's not like you're depending on profit and loss. You're getting paid bonuses to hit the target. It's not your company's sales that determine whether you're successful or not. Okay, what else do they have in this system? And another one is what they call storming. Well, what is storming? Okay, every student knows what storming is. The reason that I make you guys write a rough draft before you write your final draft on your History of Economic Thought term paper is that I know what storming is. If I just give you a term paper assignment and say, you write a term paper and turn it in, then the night before, a bunch of you are going to go storming. Oh my gosh, it's due tomorrow. And you're going to stay up all night and write a less than good term paper. Okay, that's storming. A Soviet factory, if they have an annual target, the way they often operate is they sit around for 11 months, everybody's drinking vodka or hanging around, or we're doing a little bit of stuff. Comrades, 1 month left. We have the target, the quota. Everyone, work hard. And then they suddenly run the factory for 24 hours a day for a month, or whatever, something like this. Well, that is not the way to make quality output. And so storming becomes a feature of this economy. These sudden bursts of activity that are not very effective. A final thing built into this incentive built into this is 3 words: lie, lie, lie. Nobody has an incentive to tell the truth in this story. And here's an example. Here's what that means. You're the state-owned enterprise, and you're told, make 10,000 trucks. Great. Oh my gosh, did we make 10,000? No. What should we tell the ministry? Tell them we made 10,000 trucks. So they say, the ministry says, did you make 10,000? Yes. Do you think they made 10,000 trucks, comrade? No. Do you want to tell Ghost Plan? No, do you? Ghost Plan, they made 10,000 trucks. Ghost Plan. Do you think the ministers are telling us the truth? No. Do you want to tell Stalin? No, do you? Comrade Stalin, they made 10,000 trucks. Stalin complains that nobody would tell him the truth, that he couldn't get reliable information on what's going on in the economy. It's built into this. Maybe it would have helped if he hadn't killed everybody who gave him bad news, but he killed a lot of people who gave him good news too. So, everybody has an incentive to lie in this system, and people in Russia and in Ukraine told me that permeated the system, and it became a way of life. And they say that someone told me that when that becomes a way that you deal with the state, it's one thing. But it becomes such a part of your life that you start using it in other respects, like in the family and with friends and things. It's destructive. But it's a system that builds incentives to lie into it. Here's an example of this. Magnitogorsk Steelworks. Magnitogorsk was the world's largest steelworks, and we'll talk about it in more detail in the next lecture. But they would make steel. They have an annual output quota. And the steel comes through, and they process it. Great, there's a ton of steel. Then they look at it, and they say, this is really bad quality steel. It won't do. So let's reprocess it and get it into better shape. They reprocess it, comes out, look, another ton of steel. That's built into the system to do things like that. They would send that steel out because of the overestimate of input needs. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, the Soviets decided to do an inventory of state-owned firms in the Moscow area. And they found steel that these firms had gotten that they didn't need, but they requested lots of stuff, and they would get this excess steel, and they just store it, and some of it was just rusting away out in the open. So production that doesn't make any sense. This is not a very good system. Now there's one other feature that I will mention here, and then we will take a break and move to part 2. But there is something called the success indicator problem. And that is, we've talked about how to incentivize compliance, but how do we measure compliance in this system? How do we measure it? And the success indicator problem has 2 components to it, or 2 aspects. And the first one is, how do you specify targets to measure compliance? How do you specify these targets that people, we don't even have to write to measure compliance. We'll just say, excuse me. How do you specify the targets, and how to measure compliance? And so this is the ex ante, before the fact, and this is ex post, after the fact of production. Okay? Well, that's an easy problem, again, under a market system, because we have prices, and we have profit and loss. But we can't use those in this system. We've decided to abolish them. And so what will we use? And the Soviets decide they have to use, it makes sense, it can't be profit, so we'll use physical measures. Okay? physical terms. And this becomes a real problem for them because they say, great, we are going to do things like, we'll specify think of it this way, the frying pan problem. This is actually from the Soviets knew all this stuff. The Soviet people knew it. They had a humor magazine called Crocodile, and it featured things like this, and it had a picture of a crane, and this crane is lifting this giant frying pan, and somebody's saying, good news, comrade, we have met the state tonnage for frying pans, and there's this like 5,000 ton frying pan that they're lifting up. Great, so if you specify it in physical terms, and you say, you're to make 500, 5,000 pounds of frying pans, well, they'll make one giant frying pan if that's the cheapest way to do it. Oh, that's not what we wanted. Okay, well, instead, we'll give them a number of frying pans. So make 5,000 frying pans. Great, and then you get these little teeny tiny frying pans. Well, that's not what we wanted either, but they hit the target. Okay, and that sounds ridiculous, but that's actually what happened. One of my former instructors, and we'll talk about this next time, one of my former instructors who spent time in the Soviet Union as a US intelligence officer, traveling under a diplomatic passport, went into a store. And he said, this store, the shelves are packed with women's shoes. They're all one size and one style. That's it. Because the Soviet firm had an order to make so many pairs of shoes. The cheapest, fastest way of hitting that target is to make them all one size, so you don't have to change the last, you don't have to change anything in the style, and they've got, whatever that size was, that's what they've got, and that's it, and nobody wants them. So they can make stuff, but they don't make the right stuff. Military firms are less susceptible to that. There's much more military and KGB oversight in those. They put generals in charge of those. And a general can't be fooled. He knows what a T-55 tank is or a MiG fighter jet. And so you're not going to make little teeny tiny tanks. With those, we know what they are. Well, here's the end result for this economy. Resource mobilization runs into diminishing returns. That's going to mean no growth. But then we get these perverse incentives, negative value added. We make stuff that nobody wants. Avoidance of innovation. And that's a system that's bound to implode. That's the story that we're going to tell next time.